Well, thanks very much, Pat, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'd have to say also congratulations to all of you for giving up your weekend to support your profession and try and improve the state of education in Australia. I'm going to talk obviously a lot with a Victorian perspective and not necessarily with a great deal of good news or even advice about where to go to in the future, because the situation is truly grim. I've been asked to talk about the wisdom of marketisation in Tafe, and it's a very tricky issue. I want to, first of all, trace the rationale and the process for marketisation, how it occurred and why it's so tricky. Secondly, to discuss the weaknesses of marketisation that have been identified in the literature. And thirdly, to argue that we are facing a form of ideological fundamentalism, and think about that word fundamentalism and what it means for us in other connotations. Because fundamentalism is very, very hard to dislodge. And that's what we're facing as well. We do need a new paradigm, but there's no sign that that's going to occur quickly. And the role of the trade unions in this sort of scenario, I believe, is very complex and very difficult. And that's why I commend you from being here, because I would understand if you all gave up. Now, some of us would think we were not going to say that competition doesn't work at all, because there are clearly some areas in which it does work, and we've dealt with those for many years. Wholesale, retail, manufacturing, we all enjoy the benefits of competition. More recently, we've had competition in the airlines, in banking, in the utilities, and in other areas, and probably most of us would say some of that's good as well. We do like our cheap airfares. We do like being able to shop around for our telecommunications. So it's got some good and bad, but generally, as consumers, we enjoy the benefits of competition. But what about TAFE and education more generally? We enjoy those other areas because they are truly commodities. But in my view, and I'm sure in yours, education is not a commodity, it is a right, and it's a very important service. So how did it all happen? Well, it goes back to the early 1990s, when the Commonwealth and the states and territories signed the National Competition Agreement with the competitive neutrality principles. And you can see there what the objective of those principles were. Quite importantly for me, that they were supposed to apply to the business activities of entities, and they specifically excluded those parts of those business entities that were not profit related. So at the bottom there, not to non-business, non-profit activities of these entities. So how was it that then TAFE was singled out as an entity that was entirely about business? Obviously at the time, TAFEs were being encouraged to have entrepreneurial activities, income generating activities that were separate from their government funded activities, but not everything was about profit. But somehow or other, that was the way that it was interpreted. And also importantly, it was all about the elimination of resource allocation distortions. And you've heard from Pat, and I must say it's a bit hard to follow up from Pat. Can you say anything more? those resource distortions, resource allocation distortions, have been monumental, as you've seen in the report that the AEU has recently commissioned, and I'll come back to that. So what happened was that Tafe was singled out of all of the education sectors, and I know that competition is raging in the other sectors as well, but the other sectors weren't subjected to the same sort of application of competitive neutrality principles that Tafe was. And it was seen to be just like, you know, the Qantas, the Commonwealth Bank, Telstra, any of those corporations that where competition was being applied. So that has occurred progressively throughout 1990. Now I want to look at the underpinning principles behind marketisation and behind this way of thinking that has been applied to Tafe. Firstly, the principle that individualism drives human behaviour, and boy, haven't we seen that. That economic markets are the model for the relationships in the public sector. So take an economic model, impose it on the public sector, and bingo, you've got competition, you've got perfection. Thirdly, policy implementation and delivery functions are best separated and set out in contracts. And we've seen Tafe Institute spending a lot of time trying to work their way around that. Also that we need new administrative approaches. So all of these things that have been gradually introduced, performance-based contracting, market incentives, and the deregulation is all part of it. And importantly, small government is superior. Now, all of these principles sit underneath what's happening in the application of competition policy and the application of competitive neutrality principles. It's commonly referred to as new public management, and it's been referred to that since the early 1990s when it was first introduced. So in 2008, we see the Victorian government, in its own terms, leading the way with the application of these principles, with the first of the major reforms that happened across Australia, which was called Securing Jobs for the Future. And it came out saying loud and clear that we must have change. This change was imperative, urgent, must happen now, and it's all going to deliver a wonderful vet system. The big issue here to remember is that Australia was just following in what was happening worldwide. And that all began in the 1990s as well. And what we also have to remember is that those principles, new public management, if you want to call it that, attracts bipartisan political support. So in the UK, we saw it with both the Conservatives and the Labor Party. In Australia, we've seen it with both the Labor Party and the Liberals federally, and certainly in Victoria, we've seen it with Labor and Liberals as well. And some of you won't recognise those faces, but they're two of the premiers that have been right behind it. So it was under the Brumby government, the guy on the left, who introduced it, and it was brought to its heights by the guy on the right from the Liberal Party, Dennis Napthine. Now this is in 2008, we're leading the way, but I'm here to tell you that the weaknesses of this approach were beginning to be very clearly identified by the end of the 1990s, and by mid-2000s, many weaknesses were being identified and documented by, say, 2005. So in 2008, despite all this evidence, Victoria's leading the way in the implementation of these principles. So what were the weaknesses that were being identified? And there are many, many. If you ever look at the literature and if you want any advice on where to look, I'll tell you. But I've pointed to about 8 that are the most commonly identified ones, but there are more. Firstly, that competition regimes are very costly to implement but rarely deliver genuine competition. That was being identified by the mid-2000s. That there are increased transaction costs due to the high cost of contract preparation and monitoring and so on. That there is a lack of evidence of real efficiency gains, and I think you've been hearing about that in the last few days. That the restructuring and downsizing of the public service leads to a decline in accountability. I think we've seen that as well. That we get a terrible fragmentation of relationships which may spur destructive behaviours. That the fundamental values of the public service are undermined in this regime. That the wholesale application of private sector models on the public sector simply does not work and is inappropriate. And the reforms often produce unexpected negative results. So that's at least 8. If we look at those in summary, you might wonder why there's no actual mention of a decline in quality, which for us is a major concern. But I think we can say all of those factors all contribute to an undermining of quality. So I want to take a bit of time to look at a couple of those weaknesses and give you some illustrations of how that's sort of played out in Victoria and what it leads us to. And the first one I'll look at is the first weakness itself. Competitive regimes are costly to implement but rarely deliver genuine competition. The first thing that springs to mind for me is the cost to government of monitoring 5,000 RTOs. I think it's down to 4,500 now, but at its peak, it was 5,000. And we know that that has not been done well. We know that it's failed monumentally. In October 2014, the Federal Minister, McFarlane, announced that they were going to beef up the Quality Authority, the regulator, with an additional $68 million, recognising that the job was not being done well. Now, in effect, that meant a doubling of the previous allocation. So $136 million to regulate those providers and to not do it well. And that's not the end of the money they receive, because they also charge fees in an attempt to try and become cost neutral. An enormous amount of money, and the job's not being done well. I'll jump to weakness 5. The fragmentation of relationships, which may spur destructive behaviours, and I find this one really quite distressing, because we found in Victoria that the moment the Victorian Tafe Association, representing all the Tafe institutes, began to criticise the reforms or to even question them, the Higher Education Skills Group, which is the government authority, just withdrew any communication from them, blackbanned them in effect, and would not engage with any negotiations with them at all. I mentioned the word fundamentalism as well, and bear that in mind. And likewise, a very, very hostile relationship developed with the Tafe Institutes, and I don't think that that was the preference of the Tafe Institutes. Evidence that the government department was actually mocking the institutes that it was in charge of, and that it in fact owned and was administering on behalf of the community. They mocked. One of their prize examples is that they said that Tafe stood for try and frigging enrol, although they didn't use the word frigging. I'm a lady. So these sorts of negative relationships where the government department is at loggerheads with the institutions that it's administering, I find that just absolutely appalling and unprofessional. Weakness 6, said I wasn't bringing you any joy, that the fundamental values of the public service are undermined under this regime. And what I've seen, and again, very much to my dismay, because I'm now not working in the system, but I probably get more frank news about it than I did when I was in the system. There's incentives for TAFE institutes now to also behave like the private sector, the worst of the private sector. There's incentives for them to focus on the high demand, low cost profit making programs because they've really got no alternative. Their funds have been cut, so they've got to mimic that behaviour. And at the same time, to cease delivery of those high cost programs that are so important for what we often refer to as a knowledge economy. And I've seen it happening. Each program is considered as a cost centre rather than looking at the holistic provision within an institution. And so if it costs too much and it's not making a profit, we take it off the profile. I'm not saying every TAFE institute is doing that, but the incentives are there to do it, and some of them are. And this means, to me, neglecting the needs of the economy. Do we look at the economy and say our local workforce needs X, Y, and Z to prosper? We might well say, no, those programs are not profitable for us, we won't run them, and if we don't, who does? And likewise, on the social side, the neglect of what's best for the society. Now, the government has contributed to that already by withdrawing funds for community service obligations, but there's no incentive for the TAFE institutes to try and struggle to afford those. So overall, the incentives are there to adopt the worst practices of the private sector, and that has been happening. I find very, very distressing. Weakness number 7, the wholesale application of private sector models when this is inappropriate. And this has been identified in many, many instances. But I'm going to use the example, and some of you might have heard me speaking about this before, about the imposition of the strategic planning guidelines on TAFE institutes in Victoria, this is, in 2013. The government introduced strategic planning guidelines because obviously TAFE institutes didn't know how to do strategic planning. The government needed to tell them. And they introduced a whole lot of other things. I've got 2 minutes. That were designed for marketisation as well. So the first thing that they introduced, the strategic planning guidelines in the aim of marketisation, what did they say? Well, you'd expect with marketisation they'd say those sorts of things: financial, performance, assets, profit. That's the number of times that those words were mentioned in the strategic planning guidelines. But you would also expect that they would talk about students, learners, industry, employability. Look at the number of times that they were mentioned. Not once any of those words. I have genuinely trawled it. So that was imposed on the institutions. This is how you do strategic planning, but none of those words are important. I'll skip what they said about the school, and I'm not going to be able to finish really what I want to say, but I'll try and hurry up. Weakness 8, reforms often produced unexpected negative results. Well, by 2003, the OECD had already recognised that, and the OECD is a great promoter of new public management. We've seen it in your recent AEU report, and we've certainly seen that there's been no elimination of resource allocation distortions. In fact, it's become much more distorted. Now, recently, Tafe became an election issue. What a wonderful thing to see. In the two most recent state elections, and as Pat says now, is in New South Wales. A review's been announced in Victoria. The examples of unethical and wholesale rorting are wide, but there has been no serious criticism of marketisation as an approach to date. No serious criticism. They all think that's all sitting on the margins, we can fix that up and we'll go on the way we planned. Now, why is that the case? It's the case, as I said, because I think we're facing ideological fundamentalism. And you know what that means. You ascribe to a set of views and you do not budge from them. And it's incredibly dangerous. And we've seen it with both political parties, and it is not going away despite the evidence. This sort of fundamentalism also has, unfortunately, in-groups and out-groups. And who are the in-groups? The private sector, the private RTOs, private consulting firms, employers in industry, all of their views are worth listening to. The out-groups, everything to do with the public sector. The public RTOs in particular, the public service, and of course, and unfortunately, the trade unions. They're typecast in the ways that you can see there on the screen. Not worth listening to, out of date, redundant. This is unfortunately the review, and that's why some people came out and just scrapped the AEU report out of hand, quite possibly without having read it, because it came from the AEU. Disregard the evidence. That's the way these things operate. So, in conclusion, and I've rushed a bit, thanks for the extra time, I did say that I would trace the rationale for marketisation. It's been a 25-year journey, terrible journey. Oh, sorry, go back. That I discussed the weaknesses identified in the literature, and there are at least 8 major weaknesses identified already at least 10 years ago and earlier, that there is a form of fundamentalism at work which is going to be difficult to budge. We do need a new paradigm, but nothing is really coming through, because when you're up against fundamentalism, nobody listens. And I applaud your efforts and I wish you well, but I think the chances of getting anybody to listen are actually quite slim. You as a group are not part of the in-group under the fundamentalist principles. And I say that with great sadness. Keep up the fight, and I'm there too trying to fight the fight. But I think it's going to be a long time before anybody in power will look at the evidence. And so I finish with this rather sad cartoon. The privateers are there to make money from the poor, and that's what I think this is all about. Thank you for your attention.